Hello, I'm William Buursma, and this is Markey. Our program today is devoted to the subject of the papal encyclical. And I have two guests with me, and I'd like to ask them to introduce themselves. Rudy, would you be the first?
My name is Rudolf Siebert, and I'm Professor for Religion and Society at Western Michigan University.
Good to have you here. You have been here several times before,
Yes.
and I'm very happy you can be with us today.
Thank you.
Ron?
I'm Ron Kramer. I'm a professor of sociology at Western Michigan University.
Ron, welcome to you to this program.
Glad to be here.
Ron, could you, to help our listeners, tell us what's exactly involved in an encyclical? What standing does it have? What's its origin in general? What is that?
Well, Rudy may be the better one to answer that. This encyclical in particular interests me because it deals with issues that I work with as a sociologist very, very intimately. Issues concerning development, issues concerning inequality. I teach courses on social problems. Of course, the encyclical details many of the social problems facing the developing world, and so I approach it from that perspective. Rudy may be the better one to talk about an encyclical standing within the Catholic Church.
Well, from a theological point of view, an encyclical is a letter which the Pope writes to all dioceses. It has, of course, not the certainty of a dogma. It puts some obligation, of course, on the believers. It is to be taken seriously. But it has not, it is more than a theological opinion, which would be almost nothing, but it does not have the level of a dogma, and it does not put obligations of this kind on the believer.
In some other areas, it'd be somewhat like a position paper, but a little stronger,
but
perhaps?
maybe a little bit more serious,
Yeah.
yes. Right.
What would you say is the heart of this particular formulation, this encyclical?
Well, the encyclical has in common with all the others since Leo XIII the so-called social question. I think that's very important, that one penetrates through all these different aspects of the encyclical. From a university point of view, we have the division of labor also in intellectual life, and so the Pope practically goes through all dimensions of politics, economics, and so on. So I think it's very important that one goes to the very core, and that is the social question. And of course, Leo XIII in Quadragesimo Anno, Rerum Novarum rather, 50 years after the Communist Manifesto, thought that the Church had to take a position on the social question, which is the contradiction and the antagonism of the classes in civil society. At that time, it was called the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the workers and the owners and so on. And certain inequalities and tensions and struggles between these classes. And that the Church somehow has an obligation out of its own mission somehow to address herself to this.
Ron, you mentioned that because you're a sociologist that this interests you. What areas particularly impinge on your area of expertise?
Well, I'm primarily a criminologist, and but as a criminologist, I study not only traditional street crime, which of course criminologists have long pointed out the connection between various forms of crime and social conditions such as poverty and structures of inequality. But I also specialize in the study of corporate crime, that is crime committed by business organizations. And one of the concerns that I have especially is the operation of transnational or multinational corporations and the role that they play in the world economy. And so this encyclical hits, I think, on issues that can be of concern both for street crime as well as for the broader issue of corporate and organizational crime. In addition to the focus on corporations, in the field that I specialize in, we are dealing more and more with the organizational crimes committed by government agencies as well, which also figures into this encyclical because very often government agencies, especially in the developed world in the North, have engaged in various practices or behaviors that many of my colleagues are willing to call as crime in their relationships or their dealings with those in the South. The Soviet Union and the United States, I think, are the two superpowers, and I think their behavior, whether it's in Afghanistan with the Soviet Union or American behavior in Nicaragua or in Vietnam, I think falls into the areas where a lot of my colleagues are now beginning to turn some of their attention to.
Do you find comfort for your point of view in the latest encyclical? As I hear you talk, I'm assuming that you are somewhat critical of American involvement in South America, Latin America. Does this give aid and comfort to you in your position, or are you uncomfortable with the position staked out here in the encyclical?
I found the encyclical somewhat frustrating, ultimately. I applaud the Pope's efforts to direct attention and to show the moral concern over these particular issues. I think there's some very strong statements that direct people's attention to these problems, some strong statements about things that we need to pay attention to, things that we need to do. But ultimately, I was frustrated because I felt that there was no punch to it. There was no setting out of a particular agenda, whether it was a political agenda or an agenda for social change, I think, that could be followed through to actually deal with any of those underlying social problems. So there's a great deal to be applauded in this encyclical in the way it directs our concern, especially moral concern, to these questions. But there's little attempt at, I think, developing a theoretical analysis of why these problems exist, nor is there any effort to follow up then from some sort of theoretical analysis to sketching out any kinds of programs or policies or political actions that could be taken. And of course it's difficult for the Pope to do that, I realize.
I was just going to say that it almost looks like a compromise. That he's got a little bit of a bad word for the communistic system and also the capitalistic, and also some encouragement for them. And he's almost, it seems almost a bit political. Let me ask you, Rudy, generally speaking, evangelical Protestants are of the opinion that the church ought not to get into formulating statements and making kind of testimony about political problems and questions. They suggest that the role of the church ought to be to preach the gospel, the good news of God in Christ, and to stay away from these things. Now, obviously the Roman Catholic Church doesn't share that point of view. This is a statement on the nitty-gritty of life. How do you feel? Is the Pope intruding in an area where he should not go?
I think the social encyclical letters, since 1890 or so, have evolved in that sense that the autonomy of the political system, the autonomy of the economic system is respected, so that you don't have, the integratio Christi, that you want to integrate, so to speak, the whole world under the dominion of Christ and forget the autonomy of these areas. But when you see the center question, I mean the social question, that means the class question, the Church would say that this cannot only be dealt with by economics or by sociology or anthropology or so, but that it has a specific moral dimension to it in terms of the suffering of this, that the being of the few, is paid with the not having of the many and things like this. There's a moral dimension, and this moral dimension reaches, of course, into economics and so on. Where the moral dimension comes in, the magisterium of the Church thinks that they are competent. They would say we are competent in humanity. We are not competent to develop the technology, how the techniques, how these problems should be solved, the class problem should be solved. But we are experts in humanity, and therefore, from this point of view, and because of our mission, we can, and we have, and we must speak to those problems.
So you would reject that evangelical Protestant position. You would say that that's...
Well, I would be in agreement with it when the encyclical would in any way violate the, let's see, the autonomy of the economic subsystem, because it has its own rules, of course, and so on. But insofar, or the political system. But, the political system steered over the medium of power, the economic system steered over the medium of money. There is a certain autonomy. But as soon as moral question, that means as soon as human suffering, human oppression, exploitation, and so on, comes in, I think that the Church has, from my own view, certainly, from inside out, an obligation to speak to it.
Ron, I think that the last time we talked about this, Rudy and I, then I mentioned the fact that in the encyclical there's not much that is specifically scriptural. Most Protestant groups, if they were to issue some kind of statement, would have all kinds of proof texts and references to the teachings of the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, for example, or the specific words of Christ. I don't sense that's very heavy here. Now, do you consider that to be a weakness, or is this simply something that in Roman Catholic practice isn't all that important, that you ground it in the teaching of the academics rather than in the scripture, or even in the great broad principles of sociology and the teachings of humanism, natural law? Does that bother you at all? Excuse me, does that bother you at all that there's no or very little reference to the scripture?
It doesn't bother me at all. I do think that the document is grounded in a religious tradition that I think maybe most Catholics will take for granted. In a sense, if we take seriously the idea that God is love, that Christ's mission was to love God and to love our fellow man, then of course the whole thing is grounded in that great commandment. How do we love our fellow humans? And of course, by expressing this kind of concern, with the presumption of being on the side of the poor, addressing the Pope addressing himself to these questions, I think all of that flows from this one central commandment. And if that's the impulse behind it, which I see, then I'm not bothered by the fact that there's a lack of reference to other aspects of specific reference to Scripture.
Of course, I mean, we can address ourselves, you know, to the ecumenical dimension of this. And certainly the emphasis, you know, sola scriptura and so on the Protestant side is understandable. From this point of view, I would say, you know, that there is the story, you know, of the beginning and the end, and there are a lot of stories, Lazarus and the rich man, and so there are a lot of references when you go through it. But I mean, there is another thing which, let's see, Lutherans cancel, the natural law, for instance. That would be a difference. And I would say there is a much more deeper difference now, which comes out, you know, in ecumenical terms, and that is that Catholicism has a different attitude toward the original sin as such, right? So while Luther radicalized the Pauline anthropology in that sense that we are totally corrupt in intellect and so on, and will, then the idea, you know, that you could have reforms and therefore really could improve the human condition is harder to get to, you know, any kind of contact with humanism or so, than it is with Catholicism, which would say that the intellect is deeply wounded, but not totally corrupt, so that even if you are not baptized, you can still read this. And I wouldn't go so far to say without grace you can do it or so. But in the extreme case, it would mean that there is enough goodness in people to follow those principles and transform the class system in such a way that it is bearable for particularly those on the bottom.
Well, even an ardent reformer like Calvin, with his 5 points, and one of them being total depravity, still allows much room for common grace, so that it's not a complete departure there.
That's right. But there's a difference between the two traditions, you know. I mean, Calvin has a much more political dimension to it. Luther was politically a child in comparison to Calvin. And then, yes, there is a difference. But I think all the reformers, except Zwingli or so, had a tremendous emphasis on the original sin, much more than the traditional Catholicism had. I mean, Luther's formulation, you know, sinner and redeemed at the same time, portrays the paradox and the dialectics of Christian existence. And it has something to do then, you know, when you go into praxis and you want to humanize the capitalistic system or so.
Go ahead, Ron.
I'd like to ask Rudy a question or two about the Encyclical, because on the one hand, I felt that well, let me ask this question. Do you think that the Pope is somewhat misinformed about Marxism as a philosophical system or as a social theory? He condemns Marxist collectivism or equally condemns liberal capitalism and Marxist collectivism in the document. But do you think the Pope is somewhat either misinformed or does not understand Marxism as a philosophical system and social theory?
He has his Polish experiences, of course, you know, and then he has a hard time to move from the medieval paradigm to any modern paradigm whatsoever, Marxism or whatever. I think it comes out in that part of the Encyclical where he speaks about liberation theology, where he connects development in terms of the class and the poor and so on, and connects it with liberation. Liberation and evolution, you know, belongs together for him. But you see, there is a certain, he's not entirely happy about the liberation theology taking critical analysis, you know, from the Marxists. He would like to have a liberation theology which would not do this Marxist analysis and would stay completely inside of Catholicism, which he didn't do because he borrowed from phenomenology, which is also outside of Catholicism. But he, in terms of Marxism, he would like them not to borrow too much. But, I mean, liberation theology would be emasculated if it would not use the social analysis.
But again, is that because the Pope's own experiences are grounded in the expression of Marxism, or I guess I don't know the right word here, the deformity of Marxism as expressed in a particular state, or is it because of the philosophical system?
It is his experience. I mean, that's for all of us. Experience is always important. You know? My experience of Nazism has shaped my whole life. You see. But I think it is also the tradition in which he stands, because all the encyclicals were anti-communist, anti-Marxist. And one has to see it in that context. In that context, he is not particularly negative. Here, I mean, if you Leo the 13th or Pius the 12th or something like that, it would be much stronger. So in that sense, some things have some rigidity has dissolved. So he is careful. We asked Ratzinger, his cardinal, a few months ago, why he was against Boff, the liberation theologian and so on, if it was Marxism. And the cardinal, the head of the Inquisition, said it was not Marxism. It was the threat which it poses to the church. But when you really analyze that deeply, it is Marxism after all, because the fear is that the class analysis will be applied to the church. And then the church is also a two-class system, of which one part, the clergy, owns the means of production, or the means of salvation in that sense. And then also the hierarchy was continually bound up with the slaveholders, the feudal lords, and the capitalists. And so when you apply this analysis, there are some painful revelations. So it is not Marxism, but it is Marxism nevertheless. So there is some trouble there. But they had also trouble with liberal capitalism. But the whole encyclical letter is a baptism of bourgeois evolutionism, of bourgeois progressive evolutionism. You see, somehow elevated beyond into a Christian interpretation of it. So if you
agree with that?
If
that last
Let me hear that again. I'm not sure. It's an evolution.
I would say when you read what he says about development as such, and where that comes from, and so on, it comes from let's see, bourgeois thinkers, sociologists, and so on, up to the First World War, so who stressed very much evolution. Evolution, not biological evolution, but social evolution. And Parsons took it up again, you see, finally, and connected it with his structural functionalism. And I think it is this taken up. And while the church was always against progress in the 19th century, the church emphasizes now progress, while the bourgeois scholars are not so sure of it anymore. But it is baptized at the same time, you see. So there is evolution toward a better type of society, development toward a better, there is progress and so on. But then, sinfulness is stressed, which Parsons maybe will not bring in. And, but then ultimately, of course, everything is eschatological. It goes to God's kingdom.
I would agree with that line of analysis.
Right.
It seems to me that seems to me to be a flaw ultimately in the encyclical, because that line of thinking tends to, I think, divorce the notion of evolution and progress from the hard structures of the society, from the material realities, the economic and political system. It sees them only as co-equal structures of the total social structure, rather as the foundation or the substructure which needs to be dealt with in the first instance. And so, again, my frustration, I guess, in the end with the document is that I don't think that this document actually leads us anywhere in the end. It's a kind of moral exhortation, but it doesn't address itself, it seems to me, to those hard issues and questions of political and economic structure that will need to be addressed if we are to accomplish any of the goals that the Pope wants to accomplish.
What has been the reception?
Like a true positivist. there is some truth to it.
Yeah, but what about the reception in the Catholic Church? Has it been well received? Is there ongoing discussion? Or is this a lot like documents that are issued by the World Council of Churches that, lots of copies, lots of headlines, and then dropped and forgotten again? What actually happens now with something like this?
In Thomas More, we don't hear anything about it. And I think this is true for many churches. So, I started, when I taught for the Jesuits in Baltimore, and I wanted to have a seminar on the encyclicals, and they told me, if you teach the encyclicals, you will lose all friends in Baltimore. So I taught him anyway. I did not lose all friends, but I mean, it shows, that it's a very hard area here to apply. It was applied, in the New Deal. Roosevelt, and his man, the Brain Trust, took things out of the encyclicals at that time, and so on. But in Cleveland, there was some kind of an upheaval of workers who based it on, and Father Coughlin, of course, on the far right, he used Quadragesimo Anno, and turned it into fascism, and so that was not a very good use, I think it was a terrible abuse of it, and so on. But otherwise, in normal conditions, I mean, I have something again, I teach in Thomas More every semester or so, some course on some aspect, and it's hard, there's not exactly masses of people who will flock to it.
That's true. But I guess I'm interested too in, say, the average person in the Roman Catholic Church. Does this teaching, does it impact at all on his life?
I think the encyclicals have less impact in the church in the United States than, say, the bishops' pastoral letters. The bishops, with their two latest pastoral letters, have had, I think, a tremendous impact on the church, have prompted much debate and discussion, and it's been very fruitful. I'm referring to the pastoral letter on nuclear warfare, nuclear weapons, and also the one on economic injustice. And I think those have had a tremendous impact, much discussed. But the encyclicals, I think, have less of an impact in the United States among Roman Catholics.
And there's something in general, you know, it is somewhat intellectual type of work. And I think many of our Catholics, you know, think that this may not really belong to it. A practicing Catholic is somebody who goes to the sacraments, leaves the sacrament of confession out usually nowadays, but that there is this dimension, you know, to think socially about. This is rather, I think, many of the Catholics here, that is strange. And it has something to do with a certain theological infantility of American Catholicism, which is due to an attack which Rome made in 1900 against Americanism. It was really a form of modernism, and where outstanding scholars, you know, were repressed, and so it remained rather infantile. Then in the 60s, there was an attempt to get out of this infantility. You know, two Jesuits who brought me over here were very outstanding. Their Father Weigel, for instance, Father Murray. But in the meantime, you know, we have a similar threat against theologians here, outstanding theologians who try new ways, who are repressed again. And there is the danger that we fall back into this infantility again. And this is not very favorable. You know, then it is counterproductive even in that what the Church would like to do now. Because you have to elevate yourself from normal everyday piety, so to speak, and reflect. I mean, your reflection, criteria of judgment, and then application of this whole thing. So I think that many Catholics are not used to this, or if they do it outside of the Church, but they think it shouldn't be done maybe inside of the Church.
I'm going to come back to something I'd asked earlier in the program, and that's this whole concept of what in Protestantism is considered to be the heart of the gospel as contrasted to the social gospel. And are you finding out that in the Roman Catholic Church, particularly in Europe, that there are people who are leaving it because it is speaking in harmony with this latest encyclical? Is there a kind of a feeling of, well, our church has gone to a position to the left of us, and so they're falling away? Because, as you know, the attendance in many countries in Europe, especially in Western Europe, is very, very poor. It's also true in the Protestant. And a lot of the Protestants are saying, well, our hierarchy, our leadership is left-wing and doesn't really represent us. Council of Churches, for example. Is that happening now in the Roman Catholic Church? Are they sort of forsaking the Church because it is not preaching the gospel, but it's getting involved in this sort of stuff? Do you have a feeling for that at all?
I would not say so. First of all, I mean, when I think of German Church or so, you know, the hierarchy keeps so far to the right that there is not the slightest suspicion, you know, that they may be only pink or whatever, you know.
Yeah. That's not true in the Netherlands.
I think, well, in the Netherlands,
it's very,
but people in the Netherlands wouldn't leave. They would leave because of the other reason, because they're too far to the right, and because the Pope usually continually uses his power to impose, you know, reactionary bishops and cardinals, which is the only power he has in this area. But he uses it continually, and people are very frustrated and estranged, and leave therefore, and don't practice anymore. But the other way around, and there is only a small French group, you know, under the French favor, but they have not really spread. I mean, not too many people follow him into the schism now, which it is now.
Picking up on your calling as a sociologist, what would you like to see in the Church as far as this encyclical is concerned? How would you like to see it implemented right here in Kalamazoo?
Well, I think in the first instance, simply to direct people's attention to these issues and to get them debated and discussed among Catholics. As a sociologist, you know, I think what I would like to see would be a greater awareness of some of the way in which sociological theory could shed some light, perhaps, on some of these issues, or at least provide some food for thought with regard to looking at these issues, analyzing these issues, and ultimately, of course, from an outside of the discipline, but acting on those issues. So
what about the underclass that we have, and it seems to be growing in the United States, and therefore Kalamazoo is part of this problem. Is the Roman Catholic Church doing anything to address the needs of the poor and the homeless? here locally? Is it doing something? You know, you've said, and I think quite correctly, that this is picking up on a theme in the Bible, that God is on the side of the oppressed and the poor. And even the mother of our blessed Lord says that the rich he has sent empty away, and the poor he has filled with good things. Now, what is the Roman Catholic Church doing about the opportunities to take a stand on that? Are they doing anything here locally?
I think as my bishop is concerned here, I think, you know, for the workers who come up from Mexico and so on during the summer and so on, I think something is done there and so on. But I could think, you know, of an ecumenical type of a group here in Kalamazoo, which would read this document and then would ask, you know, to what extent the social question is present here in this town. I mean, we have the north side, you know, with the rat-infested house, and we have the rich houses on the other side. So, and we have the homeless, and we have the prostitutes, and we have the people from the insane asylum, and so there is a lot of things, you know, and one could take this as a guideline, but one would need sociologists in order to bring the facts and the statistics and all that. But I could think of such an ecumenical group based on this, you know.
Yeah. But neither of you are aware of anything happening as far as the Roman Catholic Church is concerned on these issues locally?
There are specific projects through specific parishes.
But not directly, not specifically, I think, on this.
Yeah.
So then your suggestion may be a very good one, and I'm assuming that by ecumenical you don't mean just, say, the Roman Catholic Church, but you mean all branches
all
of
the
the
Protestant churches, I mean the Jewish people, I mean the Muslims in place, you know, real internal and external ecumenism.
Well, Ron, do you have any further insights? We're just about the end of our time, but anything that you wish you had said or wish that I'd asked you about?
No, just again, I would like to come back to the theme that I think that the encyclical is worth reading, and I think that there's a lot of good sentiments in there and a lot of great moral exhortation, but I wish that it had been followed up with more punch in the way of a kind of analysis of the situation that confronts us, or the looking at some of the sociological factors that shape these issues, so that we could maybe get into the discussion a bit more, what kind of practical steps could actually be taken by states and by concerned Christians to deal with these issues.
Because it can really end up being a very theoretical thing, very abstract.
It does. I think one
you have to put flesh on it.
Right.
That's true. Okay. Rudy, I can give you about 30 seconds yet for a summarizing statement.
Well, I would say there are guidelines in the end. I mean, I admit, you know, the weakest point is probably that the directives of action, you know, as we would like to have it from a pragmatic point of view. And so, but there is something about the monetary system. There is something about the trade system and so on. See, so there are some suggestions, but they have to be translated now locally. You know, they have. I mean, that would be our task. And I don't think that one can ask the Pope or the Jesuits who worked it out for him to do that for us.
And actually, the Catholic bishops have taken a giant step in that direction with their pastoral letter on economic
That's
injustice.
right, yeah. So that it is brought down to our language, our situation, our city.
Good. Well, thanks to both of you for an illuminating discussion on a rather difficult topic, but one which indeed has underneath it a very practical outcome. And let's hope that something happens in the total picture of the church. And friends, we're glad you visited with us today, and we invite you to listen again next week when there'll be another program of Markings.